Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. Hey, and welcome back to the OT is In podcast. This is a special bonus episode where I'm answering your questions. So during episodes 25 through 28, we've been talking about response inhibition, an executive functioning skill. You'll most likely hear the terms impulsivity or impulsive behaviors more often than you hear responsive inhibition. But since we're all in education and we're all lifelong learners, or you wouldn't be here, the medical jargony term is response inhibition. So in this episode, we're going to tackle some questions I posted in the OT is In membership and on my social media for people to share some incidents, scenarios, or experiences that I can talk through with my background as a homeschool mom and an occupational therapist. So without further ado, here we go. In episodes 25 through 28, you will hear us touch on response inhibition and the many ways the skill is required. Safety awareness in play, and especially on screens. You'll also hear some ways to help build the skill, like in equine therapy, and you'll hear how to prepare for an emergency or a disaster. Preparations are important for all, but require more emphasis when considering sensory needs and executive functioning skills. If any of these resonate with you, there's an additional resource at Homeschool OT. We've made a games list so you can be intentional about adding fun to your homeschool day, knowing that you're also addressing executive functioning skills. You can find this in the Homeschool OT shop or in the show notes for each of these episodes. And for further support in the area of executive functioning, we have the Executive Functioning Focus Group. This is a month-long deep dive into each of the 11 executive functioning skills. Each week, you'll have bite-sized chunks to grow your understanding, but also how to help build the skills, adjust the environment to support your children, and even ways to adapt activities. After all, we want our expectations to match our children's abilities. For those of you worried about dedicating a month to this topic, don't worry. You have lifetime access, so you can come back as your time allows or as your child develops and you need to, again, match your expectations to their new abilities. So you can find out more about the focus group at homeschoolot.com, or more specifically, homeschoolot.com/shop/executive-function-focus-group. Now, on with the show. For each of these scenarios, I'm going to talk through with regards to ways that we can help a person to build skills, though you will notice I'm not always going to be talking about the skills that simply the impulsive kid needs to build. In fact, there's a term called the double empathy situation. Now, this refers to a mismatch in perspective between two people. It's a relatively new theory, with the basis being that communication problems can occur because of a difference in perspectives of the world, conversation styles, and even different ways of gaining attention to start an interaction. It's most commonly referred to between the neurodivergent community and the neurotypical community. How it used to be that we thought that people needed to become or simulate the neurotypical behaviors, but we're not necessarily believing that anymore. In fact, we're recognizing how detrimental that can be. So oftentimes, getting over this double empathy problem requires growth in empathy, understanding, and actions of more than one person. Now, when I go through these scenarios, I'm also going to discuss the environment, like how can change or how can we adapt the environment to accommodate for the child's current skill set rather than expecting change in a person immediately. And finally, I'll talk about other activities or occupations. Remember, an occupation is any way a person occupies their time so that we can practice these skills using the child's strengths. In OT speak, we call this the PEO model, meaning that we're always going to be considering the person, the environment, and the occupation. All right, so here's scenario number one. Help! Our sensory seeker can't resist hitting his brothers on the back, head, or behind as he walks past them. Now, another person sent in a similar situation asking, how can I help my daughter who pinches and squeezes people? And both of these, I love the way that you know that your child is seeking sensory input. The question is, what kind of input? Now, I don't know this, but you, being a student of your student, can likely figure it out. So here's some questions that can guide your thoughts. So is this actual hitting, which typically gives great input to the joints, what your child is after? So if you think about hitting, if you are crashing into something, you're likely getting it with input into your knuckles, your fingers, your wrist joint, your elbow joint, all the way up through your shoulder joint, right? This deep pressure is frequently calming to the nervous system. It's frequently what people are seeking when they're trying to calm. Pinching can be the same thing. You're getting that same deep pressure or squeezing. Absolutely. You're getting that grip strength and through your fingers to help calm the nervous system. So if so, we likely want to teach ways to provide that input without another person involved. Can we talk about punching on a punching bag or squeezing stress balls, right? Now, you just heard me talk about the double empathy problem, and I do think there's learning to do here with both parties. Probably understanding sensory systems and why people react to the same stimuli differently. For the brothers or for whoever your daughter is squeezing or pinching, can they have a set language ready to say, I know you're seeking something. Let's find this other tool or this other activity to do it. So it is also important to note here that touching other people when they don't want it is never okay. We especially want our neurodivergent kids to know this, mainly because a recent meta-analysis by NIH searched 34 different research articles considering a variety of victimization types. So bullying, sexual victimizations, and crime or physical abuse. And there's a 44% prevalence rate of victimization in autistic individuals. This means physical touch needs to be a constant and continuous conversation or practice so that everyone understands consent and they expect to ask for it, but also to receive it, right? So we want to make sure that we are protecting our kids from becoming victims. So another part to think about with sensory stimuli, so is the loud reaction what they're seeking? Was it someone's stop hitting me or don't touch me? Is that what they're seeking? So if that is, which that sound can be very stimulating and the brain can have a really quick and exciting reaction to that. But if so, could we provide that through music and headphones with really quick, fast beats or podcasts that specifically not, this one might not be that exciting, but there are plenty that are more like productions with music involved in them. So as I'm asking these questions, it is important to note that this response inhibition is an executive functioning skill, and that requires the frontal lobe. And this lobe requires time to think. It's also not accessible when we have this reflexive action. So meaning a sensory input comes in and a motor response comes out. So if you have not screened for primitive reflexes, listen to these episodes 21 and 22 of this podcast and consider that option. The frontal lobe also requires a regulated brain and body, meaning a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And again, what the heck does that mean, Sarah, right? It means that we're not just thinking of the sensory system, but of the entire body as a whole, so that our kids do have access to their entire brains. This includes hydration, nutrition. It includes plenty of heavy work throughout the day. And research also shows that a connection with nature can help to provide this balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So this brings us to the environment. How often is your child outside? Even a few minutes of deep breathing or a game of I Spy with My Little Eye outside together can help to calm that nervous system so that you then do have more access to the frontal lobe to slow down. And let's think through occupation wise. Do you have a time of day or an area where rough and tumble play or hitting a punching bag are actually okay? So let's talk other occupations. Cooperative games, board games, or being outside to build a fort or put together an obstacle course are really great. These allow conversations for you to start with things like, wow, you guys really worked well together. I noticed how you both carried that log. What gave brother one or sister one the heavy work that they needed. And you guys are having a great interaction without pinching, hitting, all of that. So we want to be pretty blatant about the brain and needs and things like, wow, that heavy work really helped to calm your brain, because self-awareness can lead to self-advocacy later. Before we go on, I want to take a second to thank you for being here. Many of you started listening to the OT is In podcast after hearing some of my sessions during the convention season in June. I am so thrilled that you are all here, and I so appreciated your feedback. One person, after attending my session, Help, My Child Won't Sit, gave feedback to the Virginia convention saying, I wish we had more time with her. This was such a blessing. Well, here I am. And another person said, I loved the tips and tricks. I can always use more. So here's another tip, especially for those of you whose children learn better with the ability to move. We've used CTC math for a few years now. Each lesson is short and engaging, allowing for movement before and likely after. One of my sons completes his math lessons after completing his chores, which provide him with the pushing, pulling, carrying, or crawling, all the activities we OTs call proprioceptive feedback or heavy work. Then he sits on a sit disc or on a balance ball, and since all lessons are online, he moves wherever he feels the most comfortable. He's engaged in the lesson, and then a short time later is up and moving again with a better understanding of math. So if you're looking for short yet effective, colorful, engaging lessons, CTC Math is a perfect addition to your homeschool. Now back to the show. So the second scenario that came in was, my child doesn't think before giving answers on his schoolwork. Oh man, this blurting of answers is definitely response inhibition. It's also important to note that there's a huge burst of development around age 11. But remember that this is a range, right? So little kids or verbal processors are likely going to do this way past 11, right? I actually remember Andrew Pudewa, when I was watching an IEW video a few years back, he was telling a story of when he was a preschool teacher, which took me by surprise in first place, but he was a preschool teacher for a while, and he would ask the question and let everyone answer simultaneously. He was saying the desire to speak was less about being heard and more about being the person to talk. So he did not hold that expectation of, we're going to wait, we're going to wait, we're going to wait. And there's a lot of times where that actual waiting or raise your hand, that comes from what we're familiar with. Although there are people that really need to think and process aloud. So we want to think about, is that an okay thing for your child? Can we do that? So I would start with a question. Are you thinking out loud or are you giving the answer? And this in itself might slow the process down. So then they're thinking about that question, right? And that also will allow to increase that self-awareness. And then depending on the answer, give strategies like, have you considered this way of working the math problem? Or if it's a science question or history, have you thought about what such and such in history did or what this book character was also doing? So you're contributing to that verbal processing and also allowing them to slow their roll and really listen and think and ponder back and forth. And that there might influence their slowness or speed and being able to answer. And this is another time where the environment may be helpful. One strategy could be that you are working one-on-one, right? So where the quick blurting is okay. You could also set your computer on dictation. So then as the child is verbally processing or really quick with the answers, it pops right up, right? So that it gives feedback on how much talking is happening, but also could allow editing to then go back and find the right answer. Some occupations could be slower paced games with turn taking or puzzles that require problem solving. And again, have this conversation of, how well did you do with this? And point out, wow, you're really thinking hard as you're trying to turn that puzzle piece around. Wow, you're waiting your turn. It's really helping your sister to think what she's doing. Deep pressure or physical touch can also help, again, to calm that nervous system and allow some more of that frontal lobe to process and have some time. We used to teach my kids when they were little, we would say, show me patience. But really, what that meant was twiddle your thumbs, because you really had to focus and think about moving your thumbs around it in a circle. This worked really well in restaurants when we were waiting, or in conversation when we were having lots of other family around and they needed to pause and wait their turn. Show me patience, giving an actual movement to go along with that. You guys, thank you so much for trusting me with these questions and scenarios. I was only able to take 2 or 2.5, because 2 were very similar, because this is just a bonus episode. But please know that you are supported. And each week in the OTs and membership, we have open office hours, which work very similar to this. We ask questions and then think through it from the homeschool and OT perspective. And it's important to note it's not always me that provides the best ideas and answers. There are also families across the world on these calls, and they have great insight. And I learn from them each and every week. It's a great supportive group, and we would love for you to join us. So you can find more information about this at homeschoolot.com. And I'll see you next week, where we begin to talk about sensory processing, specifically with regards to us, the parents, so that we can then co-regulate with our kids. Thanks for being here.